This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Reports of deaths and injuries amid widespread protests against the military takeover in Sudan. The global economy, multilateralism and challenges of climate change high on the agenda as G20 leaders gather in Rome. And we examine the priorities of Africa ahead of the opening of UN climate talks. Hello and welcome to CGTN. This is Africa Live. I'm Mahia Mutua in Nairobi. Also coming up, South Africa battles a devastating outbreak of avian flu. And we look at what Uganda is doing to enhance its wildlife conservation. We begin our coverage with the unfolding political unrest in Sudan. On Saturday, dozens of people took to the streets in cities across the country. Sudanese are demanding the restoration of a civilian-led government after a military takeover on Monday. Protesters carried Sudanese flags and chanted against the military leadership. They are also demanding the release of senior political figures from detention. Naba Mohideen has the latest from Khartoum.
The protest continues in the Sudanese capital and other states all around the country. Right now, there is a reported riot in Omdurman, Bahri, and Khartoum. The bridges are still blocked by the military and some security forces. And also the access to Khartoum is blocked by the military, by heavy vehicles also. There is reported casualties. Over 17 protesters reported they were fired by live ammunition and tear gas. And the Sudanese Doctors Committee confirmed the killing of 2 protesters. There is violence also in Tuti Island, which is close to the presidential palace. The protesters were dispersed by tear gas and live ammunition too. There is heavy deployment of military and security forces all around the country, especially around the military headquarters. The internet and phone call signals are still in a blackout. Observers think the protests will likely continue because of the violence and because of the killings of the protesters. We will likely witness negotiations between the civilians and military generals because of the international pressure on the generals. We will likely see a new scene just like 2019 talks between the generals and civilians to share the power again, but with new conditions. And in this time, the pressure of the street is bigger because after the military takeover, the protesters are refusing any compromisement, and they don't want the political parties to be involved again in the scene or the military generals. So we'll probably see some calls calling for the Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok to be appointed again as a Prime Minister and to appoint a technocratic government away from the political parties and away from the rebel groups that signed the peace agreement.
Well, there is a heavy deployment of security forces in the capital, Khartoum. The United Nations and the United States have urged Sudan's top military generals to show restraint and avoid violent confrontations. The demonstrations are likely to increase pressure on the military generals who already face mounting condemnation from Western countries and the African Union. Well, joining me now from Cairo is Dr. Nabil Negm El-Din. He is an independent researcher and author of international politics. Doctor, I'll begin by asking you, what are your thoughts about Saturday's widespread protests in Sudan and what they signify?
In fact, what's going on in the capital Khartoum this morning and the other almost 25 cities of Sudanese states is telling us one thing. The people of Sudan are not gonna accept a military regime in Khartoum again. In addition to that, there is almost marches all over the world in 50 international states, starting from Sydney to Washington. Sudanese people inside Sudan and outside are fed up of military coups. I'd like to let you know that what Mr. Burhan has made last Monday was totally a jump in the dark, and he has got no support whatsoever from the international power centers, and Sudan now in a very quite sensitive moment.
And Doctor, how worried then should the countries bordering Sudan be with regards to developments in that country then?
What's going on in Sudan at large and in Khartoum has got its repercussions all over the borders, west, north, and east, because Sudan is a multi-racial state, and you find Sudanese people in the west has got some over the borders links with Chad, and you've got some Sudanese people in the east have got some links with the western of Ethiopia. In fact, what's going on in Sudan is going to affect the neighboring countries. Cairo, for example, is always caring for what's going on in Sudan, and it is considered to be a very crucial part of the Egyptian national security.
I suppose the question remains, Doctor, then what should the military authorities in Sudan do to then prevent escalations of tensions in the country?
The military establishment has got a clear warning from Washington, from the United Nations, from Lebanon, Paris. You are under our supervision. We are watching your actions against the peaceful marches in Sudan. And I don't think the military establishment in Sudan or in Khartoum will ignore such clear warnings. And on the other hand, they have to go back to that agreement which has been signed 2019 between the civil camp and the military camp. The transitional period in Khartoum was supposed to hand over power after 2 years to a civilian government. And that transitional period, which is consisted of military and civilian figures, was supposed to establish and pave the way to democracy in Sudan. So the military figures, and specifically Mr. Burhan, has got to reconsider his stance, and he has got to realize that marches in the streets of Sudan, all over 50 or 25 cities, will tell him one thing: no going back.
All right, Doctor, thank you very much for speaking to us on Africa Live. Dr. Nabil Negm El-Din, independent researcher, joining us live there from Cairo. To Ethiopia, where the federal government says it's still in control of the strategic town of Dessie in the Amhara region. The large town is around 300 kilometers from the capital, Addis Ababa. Rebellious Tigray forces had earlier claimed that they had seized the town, where thousands of ethnic Amharas have sought refuge. Fighting has escalated between Ethiopian forces and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Much of northern Ethiopia is under a communications blackout, and access for journalists is restricted, making battlefield claims difficult to corroborate. And further afield, Kuwait has given Lebanon's ambassador 48 hours to leave the emirate. This development comes a day after Saudi Arabia made a similar move. The diplomatic row has also seen Bahrain expel Lebanon's envoy. The dispute intensified on Friday after Lebanon's information minister George Kordahi criticized the war in Yemen. Meanwhile, a blast has occurred near the entrance to Aden International Airport in southern Yemen. According to security forces, a car bomb went off at an outer entrance to the airport. Reports suggest at least 10 people could have been killed from the blast. Meanwhile, Syrian air defenses have intercepted Israeli missiles targeted at sites in the countryside around the capital, Damascus, downing some of them. Reports say 2 soldiers were injured and some material losses occurred. The country's state television earlier reported that explosions had been heard in the countryside outside Damascus. Well, it's time for a quick break. When we return, the global economy, multilateralism and challenges of climate change high on the agenda as G20 leaders gather in Rome. And South Africa battles a devastating outbreak of avian flu. Welcome back. Now, the G20 Summit has kicked off in Rome with world leaders meeting in person for the first time since the start of the pandemic. Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a speech via video link calling for multilateralism and international cooperation in the fight against the pandemic. He specifically called for more vaccine support for developing nations. Beijing has said that it's ready to work with other G20 members and play a positive role in the global economic recovery and the fight against COVID-19. The first session of the G20 Leaders Summit is Global Economy and Health. Leaders will discuss ways to boost economic recovery amid the COVID-19 pandemic, rising energy prices and interruption of supply chains. Climate cooperation also tops the agenda to make headway on tackling global warming ahead of the COP26 summit. Well, leaders of the world's 20 biggest economies are expected to endorse a global minimum corporate tax of 15%. The draft conclusions of the 2-day G20 summit will seek to have the rules in force in 2023 rather. The conclusions are to be formally adopted on Sunday. In October, over 136 countries reached a deal on a minimum tax of global corporations, including internet giants like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, or Apple. This made it harder for them to avoid taxation by establishing offices in low-tax jurisdictions. Speaking at the start of the G20 summit, Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi said multilateralism is the best answer to resolve problems faced by countries in the world today.
The pandemic has kept us apart, as it did with all our citizens. And even before, we faced protectionism, unilateralism, nationalism. But the more we go with all our challenges, the more it is clear that multilateralism is the best answer to the problems we face today. In many ways, it's the only possible answer. From the pandemic to climate change to fair and equitable taxation, going it alone, it's simply not an option. We must do all we can to overcome our differences. And we must rekindle the spirit that led to the creation of this group.
Well, global leaders will be gathering in Glasgow, Scotland from Sunday for the 26th UN Climate Change Conference, seeking a collective response to the unfolding climate catastrophe. Ahead of the meeting, Africa has developed its clear demands. The continent has been hit hard by climate change in recent years. CGTN's Enoch Sikolia looks at Africa's main concerns ahead of COP26.
In early September, the Kenyan government declared the ongoing drought in some parts of the country a national disaster. The intensified heat waves are pushing livestock herders into poverty, breaking up families and communities and triggering new disputes over land and resources.
As of now, the human beings themselves are dying.
While prolonged droughts are destroying livelihoods in the northeastern part of Kenya, Some villages along the shores of Lake Turkana are being turned into islands. Rising waters are displacing people as homes sink into the lake.
This area was dry land, and we used to walk on foot from Loyangalani to buy fish. We used to walk on the road here, and vehicles would pass here, and we would walk through this place when going home.
It is really abnormal. It has blocked us. We look like people who have been isolated in a corner. We are just surviving here. It is hard to do business, and moving out of this area is difficult.
And it's because the earth has been hit hard by the effect of global warming, and Africa is feeling the heat. According to the World Food Programme, 4 years of drought in southern Madagascar had led to the world's first climate change-induced famine. In the Sahel, increasing desertification and drought is pushing cattle herders further south into the savanna areas largely occupied by crop farmers. Nancy Githaiga, the country director of African Wildlife Foundation in Kenya, says it's time that Africa's situation is put higher up on the global agenda.
If we are not facing famine, if it's not drought, then we are having floods like we see in Mozambique, like every other year. We are talking food insecurity. We are talking about water scarcity. In terms of wildlife, we are having wildlife going into community areas looking for water. All this because of climate extremes.
So what are Africa's demands at COP26?
For what we are saying, what Africa needs more are resources going into adaptation. So we are key on an adaptation goal, and also importantly on climate finance.
Developed countries pledged to donate $100 billion per year for climate action in developing countries by 2020. Nancy says it's absurd that while $20 trillion have been mobilized by developed countries to tackle COVID-19, they are yet to pay money meant for climate action in developing countries, which is just a fraction of the COVID-19 stimulus.
What we are saying is that the commitments that have been made in the past is not sufficient, and unfortunately this was also not met. So we are looking at more financing and more commitments, and actually actioning that commitment, not just a commitment.
Experts like Nancy argue that Africa's path to climate change adaptation and mitigation must by necessity diverge from those of industrialized countries. The continent is also at the center of the policy debate on energy. While rich in fossil fuels, Africans are energy poor. Enoxikolia, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Meanwhile, South Africa is battling a devastating avian influenza outbreak that has so far killed thousands of endangered seabirds along its coastline. Now, conservation experts are concerned this highly contagious viral disease could severely impact the threatened African penguin population. CGTN's Travers Andrews tells us more.
South Africa's endangered Cape cormorant population is in danger. It is facing an avian influenza outbreak like which the country has never seen. Over 11,000 Cape cormorants have already died as the disease continues to take hold of breeding colonies. Seabird Rehabilitation Centre SANCOB has been leading efforts to contain the outbreak.
We had to unfortunately put down symptomatic birds because we cannot treat the disease. And then it's only been in the last month that Cape cormorants suddenly became affected. And we're getting more and more Cape cormorant calls coming in. And then on further investigation at the colonies, suddenly there were these very large numbers that were getting sick and dying. And that's where we are at the moment, that in some of the colonies up to 500 birds are dying every day.
The disease appears to be concentrated in populations of wild seabirds and is mostly affecting the Cape cormorants. Some endangered African penguins have also been affected though, and the species remains vulnerable to the current outbreak.
In 2018 we had a similar outbreak and penguins were affected and died in South Africa and as well as in Namibia. And although it didn't have a colony level outbreak that was very severe, there was still several hundred birds that died from the disease. This year we've had a few cases in penguins, mostly in carcasses that have been found, and very small numbers at the moment. But we're still very afraid that it can cross over to the African penguin, and that could really cause a big problem if it's as infectious in the penguin as it has been in other species.
For now, most efforts are centered on separating the infected birds from the healthy ones in order to mitigate the spread of the disease. More than 5% of South Africa's entire Cape cormorant population has succumbed to avian influenza in just 1 week, and conservation officials are concerned more are dying by the day. Now they plan to open a new quarantine facility in Cape Town to determine which birds are infected with the disease and need to be euthanized. Ramzan News, CGTN, Cape Town.
Uganda is celebrating the life and times of one of its once oldest chimpanzees by raising awareness about conservation of the apes. Zakayo died in 2018 at the age of 54 after battling stomach complications. Isabel Nakiria has more on that story.
Zakayo's two wives, Amina and Ruth, and son Shaka are part of this community of chimpanzees. They are keeping the legacy of Uganda's once famous chimpanzee alive.
Zakayo was an interesting chimp, and every time you would look at him, you would feel happy. But it's sad that he died when I wasn't in the country. I just watched the news on TV, and that's why I'm here, so that I can just enjoy looking at his family.
Zakayo played a legendary role as the oldest chimp ever in Uganda. He was known to be caring. This monument was constructed in memory of Zakayo, who lived here for over 4 decades. Visitors to this park remember him for his fatherly figure and friendliness. Another chimp has been named after him, and animal keepers say he behaves exactly like Zakayo. Many visitors who came to the zoo were fond of Zakayo. Zookeepers say they miss his sense of responsibility to the younger chimps.
Zakayo had made our work easy because he used to adopt the new ones who are being brought. And now that one made our work of integration easier because each individual that we could rescue, it could become very easy for that individual to get acclimatized and cope up with a new environment.
Zakayo, the once dominant male chimp, was an ambassador of conservation. He died on 27 October 2018, and annually the zoo remembers him the entire week. Activities to mark the week include tourists participating in feeding of the chimps. Visitors to the zoo are encouraged to buy souvenirs with pictures and names of the chimpanzees, and the proceeds go to the conservation of the primates. There are just about 300,000 chimpanzees left in the wild globally. The Entebbe Zoo says more efforts are needed in protecting chimpanzees so they can live as long as Zakayo. Isabel Nakiria, CGTN Entebbe, Uganda.
Right, and here's what's coming up in the sport. Ivorian Wilfred Zaha shines as Crystal Palace shock English Premier League champions Manchester City at the Etihad.
In the desert country of Namibia, an unlikely fashion movement is amassing growing interest. Laurentius Gebart, or Lou the Vintage Guru, as he is known, is a leading figure in the so-called Afro-Dandy movement.
The more you look good, the more people will take you seriously.
Together with his friends, he searches out second-hand pieces of clothing, remolding them into bold and exciting new vintage fashion statements.
In Africa, for the Africans.
Lou is putting African fashion on the map, but he also has a deeper purpose: to make style and dignity accessible to the poor.
We have a slogan that says, dress cheap, look rich.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Right, well, we begin with Saturday's English Premier League roundup. Manchester City suffered a shock 2-0 defeat at the hands of Crystal Palace at the Etihad